long time since anyone's talked about or thought about Elden Ring. One of the most forced AstroTurf games of the decade so far. Elden Ring was one of those products that was propped up to try and destroy Nintendo, right? One of those things that was like, forced into relevancy by corrupt game journals and YouTubers who needed something to distract from the fact that like Nintendo Switch was dominating the market and dominating gamers' attention, right? Like, well, Elden Ring exists. Well, it's not very good now, is it? It's kind of shocking, now that I've played Xenoblade Chronicles 3, just how much better Nintendo's offerings were than FromSoft's around that time. But I've talked about this before. It's old, it's done and dusted. The game's old and forgotten, and nobody really cares about it anymore. And a lot of these people are kind of exposing themselves as frauds now. Like it's really common to see people like YouTubers play the game and like acknowledge that like, oh, I'm using a guide so I can get through this. It's like there's no sense of adventure. There's no like skill involved, right? Like it is an absolute stream bait game, okay, with no real redeeming qualities. It is the Five Nights at Freddy's of action RPGs. That's how lowly I think of Elden Ring at this point. It really has no redeeming qualities at all. And going into Nightreign, the first ever sequel to Elden Ring, was a really interesting situation because we saw people brush this under the rug. They tried to say this was like, this was an announcement they made to stave off like the Chinese investors or whatever. Like I think they were like I think FromSoft was in the process of being acquired or something, and they had to like announce something like that would like it was like some mess or whatever. But like they announced this thing and it was brushed immediately under the rug. And that's kind of crazy if you think about it. That FromSoft announced an Elden Ring spinoff that is getting no attention from anybody at all. Nobody is really talking about this. And for a very good reason, because this is something that goes completely against everything that FromSoft fanboys pretend to believe. This idea that FromSoft is some hardcore single player experience that the audience wouldn't tolerate any kind of cheap derivative knockoff products, right? That From is like one of the most base developers in the industry, all of which are not true at all, right? But Nightreign specifically seems to be something that is an attempt at pulling in the mass market, something that's going to appeal to normies, outside of the Elden Ring core audience. And, nobody would like this. Nobody wants to acknowledge this. They're making excuses for this at this stage, but it does need to be talked about. Nightreign looks like it's going to be a complete and total disaster, right? It's like some kind of like PvP thing. Like, I don't know how it's going to work. We don't know anything about it yet. But one of the big things that has become apparent by looking at like the information available online and seeing the statements that have been made about the game is that it is going to feature microtransactions with real money. FromSoft is going to charge you real money to play their terrible Elden Ring spinoff, right? They're going to charge you microtransactions to like upgrade your gear, to upgrade your character. It could be a replacement for the soul system actually, where you just like instead of like fighting enemies to get EXP, you just put like real money in, right? You just know that's what it's gonna be, right? You're gonna be paying for cosmetics, you're gonna be paying for like all this stuff, right? And it's gonna be this big, happy, fun time for all, a new game of the year. Of course not, like this is something that is clearly doomed to fail, because I've said this before in regards to FromSoft. Like, the audience simply isn't interested in anything outside of, like, the Souls formula. Any like slight deviation from it, whether it's Sekiro or Bloodborne, like Armored Core, like all of it like suffers like just a severe lack of interest from the general community. Like they simply aren't interested in anything that isn't like a black and roll simulator, right? They aren't interested in anything outside of just the typical like from slop formula of just wandering around a post-apocalyptic landscape, talking to these boring NPCs with only a handful of lines and going around and just like, backstabbing guys like for the entire time. Like that's what they want. That's all they want to do. Like they don't want anything fresh, new, exciting, or different. Like they just want to do the same thing over and over again because it's the only skill set they've developed over the past decade, right? They can't play actually difficult video games. They've adapted to the from slot formula so much that they can't handle anything that's a little bit different from it. They'll call it cheap or like uninspired or a Souls knockoff or not as challenging or not worth their time. But the reality is like FromSlot just isn't that good of a developer. Never has been. But a Nightreign might very well be the first time that they put out something that directly goes against this formula because this is an actual spin-off of that IP that is being utilized to try and capitalize on like its normie appeal, Like they're gonna try and take the Elden Ring thing and slap more normie friendly mechanics onto it. Like they are casualizing the Elden Ring experience. Not that it wasn't already casualized, but they're taking that aspect and making it even more casual, even more boring, even more basic. Like it's they're stripping down everything that people liked about Elden Ring to sell it to the kind of people who will pay for microtransactions, right? Like it's going to be really interesting seeing like what the copes are in regards to this game because at the very least I think it's safe to say that like this isn't going to be as well received as Elden Ring. People aren't going to line up and buy it just because it's Elden Ring, right? Nobody wants to support this. Nobody cares. Nobody asked for this, right? This is the inevitable fate of FromSlop is that they are going to get tied down by uh, their existing fan base, and they won't be able to branch out. They won't be able to do anything new because their audience doesn't want anything new. They will reject anything that isn't yet another FromSlop clone. And in their desperation to break free of their shackles of this audience, they are going to do everything they possibly can to become more and more mainstream and to try and pull in more and more players, to try, out of sheer desperation, to keep their company relevant.